The old woman's hands trembled as she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a small cloth pouch that had seen better days. Martha Hendricks had lived through 73 winters on the frontier, and each one had carved deeper lines into her weathered face. But today, as she sat across from young Sarah Coleman in the dim cabin light, those lines seemed to soften with something approaching hope. "Child, I'm going to tell you something that might sound like nonsense to most folks," Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent surviving in a land that showed no mercy to the unprepared. "But sometimes the simplest things hold the greatest power, and sometimes what seems like foolishness to the world carries more wisdom than all the book learning you could ever gather." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the rough-hewn wooden chair, her own troubles weighing heavy on her young shoulders. At 22, she'd already buried a husband, lost 2 babies before they could draw their first breath, and watched her small homestead struggle against drought, locusts, and the endless challenges that came with trying to carve out a life in Nebraska territory. Her eyes, once bright with the dreams that had carried her west with Thomas, now held the hollow look of someone who'd given up believing that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. "Mrs. Hendricks, I appreciate your kindness, truly I do," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure there's anything that can help me now. Sometimes I think maybe I'm just cursed to lose everything I touch." Martha's weathered hand reached across the small table between them and gently covered Sarah's trembling finger. "That's exactly what I thought 40 years ago when I first came to this territory, lost my first 3 children to fever, watched my husband get trampled by a spooked horse, and spent 2 winters eating nothing but cornmeal and hope. I was ready to pack what little I had left and head back east with my tail between my legs." The older woman's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing through the cabin walls into memories that lived somewhere beyond the present moment. "It was an old Pawnee woman who taught me what I'm about to share with you. I'd been trading with her people for supplies, and she could see the defeat in my eyes. She told me something that day that changed everything, though it took me years to truly understand what she meant." Sarah leaned forward slightly, drawn despite herself by the conviction in Martha's voice. Outside, the November wind rattled the cabin's shutters, and the sound of approaching winter carried with it all the familiar fears of making it through another harsh season. "She said that the earth holds power we've forgotten how to ask for, and that sometimes the simplest acts of faith can open doors we didn't even know existed. She taught me about putting salt in my shoes, but not for the reasons most folks might think." The younger woman's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Salt in your shoes? Mrs. Hendricks, I don't understand." Martha smiled, the expression transforming her face from careworn to almost radiant. "Salt draws moisture, child. Everyone knows. We use it to preserve meat, to cure hides, to keep food from spoiling. But that old Pawnee woman, she understood something deeper. She knew that salt doesn't just preserve what's dead, it has the power to draw life toward what's living." Rising from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones had absorbed decades of hard living, Martha moved to the small window overlooking Sarah's struggling garden. Even in the fading light, they could both see the evidence of the young woman's attempts to coax life from the stubborn soil: withered corn stalks, a few scraggly bean plants clinging to makeshift trellises, and the bare patches where vegetables had simply refused to grow. "When you put salt in your shoes and walk your land, you're not just spreading minerals into the soil," Martha continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing sacred knowledge. "You're making a declaration. You're telling the earth that you're ready to draw good things toward you, that you're willing to take steps, literal steps toward changing your circumstances." Sarah stood and joined the older woman at the window, studying her own failed attempts at cultivation. "But Miss Hendricks, look at what I've managed to grow. Even with all the work I've put in, everything dies. Maybe some people just aren't meant to make things flourish." "That's where you're wrong, child." Martha's voice carried a firmness that brooked no argument. "I thought the same thing until I learned that sometimes we're trying so hard to force growth that we forget to invite it. There's a difference between demanding that life bend to our will and creating conditions where life wants to take root." The old woman returned to her chair and carefully opened the cloth pouch she'd been holding. Inside was coarse salt, gray and unrefined, nothing like the fine white crystals that came from back east. "This isn't just any salt. I've been carrying this with me for 40 years, adding to it bit by bit. Some of it came from tears I cried over my children's graves. Some of it came from the salt licks where the buffalo used to gather before they moved on. Some of it came from the Great Salt Flats 3 days' ride south of here, where the earth itself sweats out its mineral wealth. Sarah found herself transfixed by the simple pouch and its content. There was something about the way Martha handled it, with such reverence and care, that suggested this was more than just a folk remedy or an old woman's superstition. The morning after that Pawnee woman taught me about the salt, I got up before dawn and put a pinch in each of my shoes. Martha continued, her voice growing soft with memory. Then I walked every inch of my land, from the cabin to the creek, from the pasture to the woodline. With every step I felt like I was planting tiny seeds of possibility. And did it work? Sarah asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. Martha's laugh was rich and warm, filling the small cabin with a sound that seemed to push back against the approaching darkness outside. Child, 3 days later a wagon train came through looking for a place to winter over. The leader offered to trade me 2 milk cows and a breeding pair of chickens for the right to camp in my south pasture. A week after that I found a natural spring on my property that I'd somehow missed in all my years of living here. By spring I had enough water to irrigate twice as much land as I'd ever been able to plant before. Sarah's skeptical expression must have been obvious, because Martha held up a weathered hand. Now I'm not saying the salt made those things happen like some kind of magic spell, but I am saying that something changed in me when I started taking those morning walks. I began noticing things I'd been too tired or too discouraged to see before. I started talking to neighbors I'd been too proud to approach for help. I found myself making decisions based on possibility instead of fear. The older woman reached across and took Sarah's hands again, this time pressing the small pouch into her palms. The salt is just salt, child, but the walking, the intention, the willingness to believe that tomorrow might hold something different than today, that's where the real power lives. Sarah looked down at the pouch, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, not just physically but in some other way that she couldn't quite name. Mrs. Hendricks, I want to believe you, but I've been disappointed so many times. What if I try this and nothing changes? What if I'm still alone and struggling and barely making it through each day? Then you'll be exactly where you are right now, Martha replied matter-of-factly. But what if you don't try? What if the thing you're looking for is waiting just outside your door and the only thing standing between you and finding it is your own unwillingness to take a few steps with intention? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the cabin's small fire. Outside, the wind continued its restless movement, but somehow it no longer sounded quite so threatening. Instead, it seemed to carry possibilities, whispers of change that might be coming with the morning light. There's something else I need to tell you, Martha said, settling back in her chair with the air of someone preparing to share a deeper truth. The salt works differently for different people, and it doesn't always work the way you think it will. That first winter after I started my morning walks, I lost my remaining livestock to wolves. I was ready to give up again, to curse the old woman who'd filled my head with foolish hope. Sarah felt her heart. Of course there would be a catch, a reason why this simple solution couldn't possibly work for someone like her. But here's what I learned, Martha continued, her voice gaining strength. Sometimes what looks like loss is actually clearing space for something better. Those wolves that took my animals also showed me weak spots in my fencing that I never would have found otherwise. When I rebuilt, I made everything stronger. The next spring, when that wagon train came through, they were specifically looking for someone with secure enclosures for their animals. If I'd still had my old weak fencing, they never would have chosen my land. She paused, letting the words settle between them like seeds finding their place in fertile soil. The salt doesn't guarantee that everything will go exactly the way you want it, but it does seem to guarantee that you'll be more aware, more alert to opportunities and connections that you might otherwise miss. Sarah found herself thinking about all the times over the past year when she'd been so focused on her struggles that she'd barely looked up from her daily tasks. How many neighbors had she failed to really see? How many small signs of possibility had she walked past without noticing? How many conversations had she avoided because she was too wrapped up in her own sorrow to imagine that others might be dealing with challenges of their own? Miss Hendricks, can I ask you something that might sound strange? Child, after 40 years on the frontier, nothing sounds strange to me anymore. Do you think there's something wrong with me? I mean, something that makes me unlucky or cursed, or just naturally prone to losing everything I care about? Martha's expression grew serious, and she leaned forward until her weathered face was just inches from Sarah. Listen to me carefully, because this might be the most important thing I ever tell you. There is nothing wrong with you, nothing cursed or unlucky or fundamentally broken. You've had more than your share of heartbreak, that's true, but that doesn't make you damaged good. It makes you someone who's learned firsthand how precious good things are when they come. Tears began to gather in Sarah's eyes, and she didn't try to stop them. For months she'd been carrying the weight of believing that somehow she was responsible for all the loss and disappointment in her life, that there was something in her very nature that drove good things away. The salt ritual isn't about changing who you are, Martha continued gently. It's about changing how you move through the world. Instead of walking through your days like you're apologizing for taking up space, you start walking like someone who has every right to be here, someone who's actively inviting good things to find their way to her door. The older woman stood and moved to the small shelf where she kept her few precious possessions. A Bible with pages softened by countless readings, a daguerreotype of a young couple who must have been her parents, and a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. "I want to show you something," Martha said, bringing the box to the table. Inside, carefully wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, was a collection of small objects that seemed to glow in the firelight. There were smooth river stones, dried flowers, a hawk feather, several coins of different denominations, and what looked like a child's wooden toy horse. "These are things I've found during my morning walks over the years," Martha explained, her voice soft with reverence. "Every one of them appeared in my path after I'd started the salt ritual. Now I'm not saying the salt made them appear. Rocks and flowers and lost coins are part of any landscape. But I am saying that before I started those intentional walks, I never would have noticed them." Sarah picked up the small wooden horse, running her fingers over its worn surface. "This looks like it was carved by someone who loved the person it was made for. I found that the winter after I lost my last child. It was half buried in snow near the creek, and something made me stop and dig it out. I kept it as a reminder that even in the depths of loss, there are still small beautiful things waiting to be discovered." The younger woman felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "Mrs. Hendricks, I think I'm beginning to understand. It's not really about the salt at all, is it?" Martha's smile was radiant. "Now you're getting somewhere, child. The salt is just a tool, a way of reminding yourself to pay attention, to stay open to possibility, to move through your world with intention, instead of just surviving from one day to the next." As if responding to some unspoken cue, both women turned toward the window. The November sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost impossible after the gray challenges of the day. In that light, even Sarah's struggling garden looked different. Not like a failure, but like potential waiting for the right conditions to unfold. "I want to try it," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Tomorrow morning I want to put salt in my shoes and walk my land." "But Mrs. Hendricks, what if I don't know how to pay attention the way you're talking about? What if I'm too sad or too scared to notice the good things that might be there?" "Then you start small," Martha replied, carefully rewrapping her treasures and returning them to their box. "You don't have to transform overnight, you just have to be willing to take one step at a time, to notice one small thing each day that you might have overlooked before. Maybe it's the way the morning light hits your cabin walls. Maybe it's the sound a particular bird makes just before dawn. Maybe it's the feeling of your feet connecting with the earth that supported you through all your troubles." The older woman moved to the cabin door and opened it slightly, letting in a rush of cool evening air that carried the scent of coming frost and the promise of winter's rest. "The land doesn't judge you for your struggles, Sarah. It doesn't hold your losses against you or demand that you prove yourself worthy of spring's return. It just waits, patient and constant, ready to support whatever you're brave enough to plant." Sarah joined her at the door, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched beyond her small homestead. For the first time in months, the endless horizon didn't look threatening or overwhelming. Instead, it looked full of possibilities she simply hadn't learned to see. "There's one more thing," Martha said, pressing the cloth pouch firmly into Sarah's hands. "The salt works best when it's shared. After you've walked your land for a while, after you've started to notice the changes in how you move through your days, find someone else who needs to remember their own worth. Pass along what you've learned. The power grows when it's given away free." As the last light faded from the western sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember: anticipation for tomorrow. Not the desperate hope that everything would suddenly become easy, but a quieter confidence that she had the strength to meet whatever came, and the wisdom to recognize good things when they appeared in her path. "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks," she said, her words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. "Not just for the salt, but for reminding me that I don't have to stay stuck in the place where grief left me." The older woman smiled and pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she prepared to make her way home through the gathering darkness. "Remember, child, you're not trying to force anything to happen. You're just making yourself available for the good things that are already looking for you. Sometimes that's all the magic we need." As Martha's lantern light disappeared down the prairie path, Sarah stood in her doorway holding the small pouch of salt. Tomorrow she would rise before dawn and begin her walks. Tomorrow she would start paying attention to her world in a way she never had before. Tomorrow she would take the first steps toward inviting change, rather than simply enduring whatever came her way. The salt in her hands felt warm, though that was surely just the heat from her own palms. But as she closed the cabin door against the November night, Sarah could swear she felt something stirring in the darkness around her homestead, not threatening or ominous, but alive with potential. For the first time since Thomas died, she found herself looking forward to seeing what the morning light might reveal. Put salt in your shoes today, and discover that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of faith.